Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. Truly, when I look out into a room like this, I don't just see an audience. I see stories. I see decades of life experience. I see grandparents, parents, caregivers, veterans of life. And I want you to know something right from the beginning. It is an honor to speak to you. My name is Dr. Antonio Miles. I've been practicing medicine for over 40 years. I specialize in metabolic health, aging biology, and preventive medicine. Over the course of my career, I've treated thousands of patients, from people in their 20s trying to prevent disease all the way to patients in their 90s determined to keep their independence. But tonight's talk is very personal for me, because what I'm about to share with you changed the way I practice medicine. And it started with a patient I will never forget. Her name was Margaret. Margaret was 73 years old when she first walked into my clinic. Bright eyes, sharp mind, the kind of woman who had clearly taken care of people her entire life. She sat down across from me and said something I've heard hundreds of times. "Doctor, I just want to make sure everything is okay." Now, Margaret had been doing exactly what most seniors are told to do. Every year she had her blood work done. Every year the same panel of tests. Every year the same reassurance. Everything looks normal. But something wasn't normal. Margaret was exhausted. She had gained 20 pounds in 3 years. Her memory was slipping. Her joints hurt. Her blood pressure had crept upward, and she had started to develop numbness in her feet. Now, according to the blood tests she had been getting every year, everything was fine. But sitting across from me that day, Margaret didn't feel fine. And this is where things took a turn. I ordered a completely different set of blood tests. Tests that most routine checkups do not include. Tests that almost never get discussed unless a patient specifically asks. When those results came back, the picture was crystal clear. Margaret's body had been heading toward metabolic collapse for nearly a decade. Her insulin levels were dangerously high. Her inflammation markers were elevated. Her triglyceride to HDL ratio was screaming metabolic dysfunction, and her vitamin D levels were critically low. The shocking part: not one of these had been tested in her annual checkups, not once. Margaret looked at me and said something I will never forget. "Doctor, how could all my tests be normal if my body was falling apart?" That question haunted me, and it forced me to confront a reality about modern medicine that many physicians are uncomfortable admitting. We are often testing the wrong things, or we are testing things that don't actually predict disease. Meanwhile, the markers that could truly warn us early, the ones that could save lives, are often ignored. Tonight, I want to pull back the curtain on this, because if you are over 60, the blood test you get or don't get can literally determine how the next 20 years of your life unfold. Tonight, we are going to talk about 4 blood tests doctors push every year, tests that in many cases provide very little useful information. And we are going to talk about 4 blood tests that could detect disease 10 to 20 years before symptoms appear. Tests that could prevent heart attacks, prevent diabetes, prevent cognitive decline, even extend lifespan. Now let me be very clear. I'm not here to criticize doctors. I am one. Most physicians are good people working inside a system that rewards speed and routine. But the system itself has blind spots. And tonight, we are going to shine a very bright light on them. Because once you understand what your blood is actually telling you, you will never look at a routine checkup the same way again. And I want to begin by explaining something fundamental, something most people have never been told. Because the real problem isn't just which tests we run. The real problem is that most of the diseases that affect seniors develop silently for years, sometimes decades before a single symptom appears. Let me explain this with an image. Imagine your body as a massive city, a city with millions of factories, power plants, roads, delivery trucks, water systems, and communication networks. Every one of those factories is a cell. Every road is a blood vessel. Every delivery truck is a hormone carrying instructions. Your liver is a processing plant. Your kidneys are filtration plants. Your heart is the central pumping station that keeps the entire city supplied. Now imagine that in this city, tiny problems start appearing. A pipe gets slightly clogged. A power station begins running inefficiently. A delivery route gets backed up. None of these problems shut the city down immediately. Life goes on, but slowly, quietly. The system starts to strain. Traffic builds. Energy production drops. Waste removal slows. And eventually, after years of subtle damage, something breaks. A major pipe bursts. A power station fails. A traffic collapse shuts down the entire network. That moment is what we call disease. A heart attack, a stroke, diabetes, dementia. But here's the truth most people don't realize. By the time those events happen, the damage has usually been building for 10 to 20 years. And here's the tragic part. The body sends warning signals the entire time. Signals that appear in the blood long before symptoms, but only if we measure the right markers. Unfortunately, many routine blood panels focus on what I call late-stage indicators. These are numbers that often change only after significant damage has already occurred. And even worse, many lab reference ranges are so wide that people can be metabolically sick and still be labeled normal. Let me say that again, because this is critical. You can have metabolic dysfunction for years and still have normal blood work. Now, how many of you here get a yearly checkup with blood tests? Let me see a show of hands. Almost everyone. That's good. Preventive care is important. But what if I told you that some of those tests your doctor orders every year are not actually telling you what you think they are telling you? Let's start with one of the most common. Total cholesterol. Now cholesterol has been the villain of cardiology for decades. Patients come in terrified because their total cholesterol is slightly elevated. Doctors prescribe statins. Everyone feels like something important has been addressed. But here's the physiological truth. Total cholesterol by itself tells us almost nothing about cardiovascular risk. It's like measuring the number of cars in a city without knowing whether traffic is flowing smoothly or whether the highways are gridlocked. Two people can have the same total cholesterol and dramatically different heart disease risk. What actually matters is how cholesterol is being transported and processed. That means things like triglycerides, HDL levels, particle size, and inflammation. But many routine panels stop at total cholesterol and LDL. Which brings me to the second test doctors emphasize heavily. LDL cholesterol. LDL is often labeled bad cholesterol But that label oversimplifies a very complex system. LDL is actually a transport vehicle. It carries cholesterol to cells that need it. The real problem occurs when LDL particles become damaged by oxidation and inflammation. When that happens, they can lodge inside blood vessel walls. But standard LDL tests don't tell us whether those particles are large and stable or small and dangerous. They simply give a number, again, useful in context, but incomplete by itself. Then we have the third test, fasting glucose. Now, fasting glucose measures how much sugar is in your blood after not eating. Doctors often use it to screen for diabetes. But here's the catch. Fasting glucose often remains normal for years, while insulin resistance is silently developing. By the time fasting glucose rises, metabolic dysfunction is already well underway. It's like checking the water level in a dam after the cracks have already formed. And finally, the fourth test doctors often push heavily, the basic metabolic panel. Now, this test measures things like sodium, potassium, and kidney markers, important for acute illness. Very useful in hospitals, but in relatively healthy seniors, it often tells us very little about long-term metabolic health. So let me ask you something. If these commonly ordered tests are limited, what should we be measuring instead? What markers actually reveal what is happening inside the body years before disease appears? This is where things become fascinating, because modern metabolic research has uncovered several blood markers that function almost like early warning radar systems. They reveal hidden dysfunction long before symptoms appear. And understanding these markers requires us to look deeper into the biology of aging. Inside your body right now, trillions of cells are constantly producing energy. Inside each cell are tiny structures called mitochondria. Think of them as power plants. They convert nutrients into ATP, the energy currency that fuels everything from muscle movement to brain function. But as we age, something begins to happen. Mitochondria become less efficient. Inflammation begins to rise. Hormonal signaling becomes distorted. And one hormone in particular begins to play an outsized role: insulin. Insulin is one of the most powerful hormones in the human body. It acts like a key that unlocks cells so glucose can enter and be used for energy. But when insulin levels remain elevated for years, often due to excess refined carbohydrates and sedentary lifestyle, cells begin to resist its signal. This is insulin resistance. Now here's the critical detail. When cells become resistant to insulin, the pancreas compensates by producing more insulin, much more, sometimes 2 to 4 times normal levels. But blood glucose may remain normal for years, which means standard glucose tests appear fine. Meanwhile, insulin levels are quietly climbing higher and higher. This is the early stage of metabolic disease, and the blood test that reveals it, fasting insulin. This is one of the most powerful markers of metabolic health. Yet most doctors never order it. Why? Partly tradition, partly insurance reimbursement structures, partly outdated training. But when I began routinely measuring fasting insulin in my clinic, I started seeing patterns that changed everything. Patients with normal glucose often had dangerously high insulin, and when we addressed that early, we could reverse the entire metabolic trajectory. Now, this brings us to the turning point of tonight's discussion, because there is a moment in the biological timeline of metabolic disease when everything changes, a moment most people never feel. But it transforms the entire metabolic landscape of the body. It happens when insulin resistance reaches a critical threshold. Imagine again that city we talked about earlier, the traffic system. For years, traffic has been building slowly, congestion increasing, detours forming. But one day, a major highway closes. Suddenly, traffic backs up everywhere. Delivery trucks can't reach factories. Power plants don't receive fuel. The entire city gridlocks. In the body, that highway closure happens when insulin signaling becomes so impaired that glucose can no longer efficiently enter cells. Now, glucose begins accumulating in the bloodstream. Blood sugar rises. The pancreas works overtime trying to compensate. Eventually, it becomes exhausted. This is the moment when prediabetes turns into full diabetes. But here is the astonishing part. This entire process can take 10 to 15 years, which means we have an enormous window of opportunity to detect it early. And the blood tests that reveal it are not the ones most commonly ordered. Tests like fasting insulin, triglyceride to HDL ratio, C-reactive protein, and vitamin D. Now I want to pause here for a moment because this is important. Every time I run these tests in my clinic, I see patterns that routine panels miss entirely. Patients who look normal on paper suddenly reveal hidden inflammation, hormonal imbalance, and metabolic dysfunction. But once we see it, we can fix it. And this brings us to one of the biggest myths in modern medicine, the idea that aging automatically means decline. I hear this constantly. Doctor, I guess this is just what happens when you get older? No. Aging does not automatically mean metabolic disease. Much of what we associate with aging is actually the cumulative effect of metabolic dysfunction. And when we correct that, the body often rebounds in remarkable ways. I have seen 70-year-old patients restore insulin sensitivity, normalized inflammatory markers, reverse fatty liver, improve memory, regain energy. The human body has an extraordinary capacity to repair itself when given the right conditions. But first, we have to measure the right signals. Now I want to spend a few minutes dismantling some myths that circulate widely around blood testing. One myth I hear constantly is this: if my doctor didn't order the test, it must not be important. That assumption is understandable, but medicine evolves. Guidelines change slowly. Research often moves faster than clinical practice. Another myth is that normal lab ranges equal optimal health. Let me be very clear. Lab reference ranges are statistical averages. They include a large portion of the population, including people who are already metabolically unhealthy. Optimal ranges are often much narrower. And the third myth I hear all the time is that heart disease is primarily about cholesterol. In reality, cardiovascular disease is largely driven by inflammation, insulin resistance, and metabolic dysfunction. Cholesterol plays a role, but it is only part of the story. Now let me share something fascinating from clinical research. Several years ago, a group of researchers analyzed thousands of heart attack patients. They found that nearly half of them had normal LDL cholesterol levels before their heart attack, but almost all of them had elevated markers of inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. Which brings us back to the tests that could truly change the trajectory of aging. Fasting insulin, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, triglyceride to HDL ratio, vitamin D. These four markers together provide a window into metabolic health, inflammation, cardiovascular risk, and immune resilience. In my clinic, when we track these markers and intervene early, we often see dramatic improvements within months. Patients lose visceral fat, blood pressure drops, energy returns, and perhaps most importantly, the trajectory of aging shifts. Now let me talk about what you can actually do with this information. Because knowledge without action is useless. The first step is simple. Ask for the right tests, specifically fasting insulin and high sensitivity CRP. The second step involves nutrition. Reducing refined carbohydrates dramatically lowers insulin levels. Whole foods, healed, high fats, adequate protein, these stabilize metabolic signaling. The third step is movement. Muscle contraction acts like a sponge that absorbs glucose from the bloodstream. Even a daily 30-minute walk can significantly improve insulin sensitivity. The fourth step is sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation raises cortisol and insulin resistance. 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep restores hormonal balance. Now, before I close tonight, I want to return to Margaret. The woman I mentioned at the beginning, after we identified her metabolic issues, we began a very targeted protocol. We improved her diet, added resistance training, corrected her vitamin D deficiency, focused on sleep and stress management. Within 6 months, her insulin levels dropped by half. Her inflammation normalized. She lost 15 pounds. And perhaps the most remarkable change, her energy came back. The brain fog lifted. She started hiking again at 74 years old. 1 year later, she came back to my office with a photograph. She had climbed a mountain with her grandchildren. She looked at me and said something I will never forget. "Doctor, I feel like I got 10 years of my life back." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why this conversation matters. Your blood is not just a lab report, it is a story about what is happening inside your body long before symptoms appear. And if we learn how to read that story correctly, we can change its ending. Your body is not fragile. It is adaptive. It is resilient. And when you give it the right signals, it has an extraordinary ability to heal. So tonight, I want you to leave with one thought. Don't just ask if your blood tests are normal. Ask if they are revealing the truth. Because the difference between those two questions can change the course of your life. Thank you for being here tonight. And if you found this discussion valuable, I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, share your experiences, and most importantly, keep asking better questions about your health.